The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this IT governance webinar on data flow mapping, a key requirement of compliance under the General Data Protection Regulation. My name is Alan Calder. I'm the founder of IT Governance, and I'm going to be your host today. IT Governance is a business set up some 15 years ago to help organizations manage their data protection and information security obligations, and my involvement in information security goes back to the late 20th century. A number of books and publications that I've written have been at the heart of the evolution of IT governance, which is now the world's leading one-stop shop for everything to do with the management of information security, the governance of IT, risk and compliance. As a business, we cover the very broad range of areas that you'd expect, from that IT GRC heading, from cyber resilience through to ITIL service management, Prince 2 and so on, with a very significant activity around GDPR compliance, information security, and of course PCI DSS penetration testing and so on. We work with organizations of all sizes in all vertical sectors in all parts of the world. We recognize that we need to be able to deliver packaged and customized products and services to meet the requirements of organizations. And a lot of what we're saying in this webinar today is drawn from the experience of the last 15 years and the thousands of organizations with whom we've worked to tackle GDPR and information security projects of one sort or another. By way of introduction, today we're going to look very briefly at the background to the GDPR, its impact, the liabilities and penalties. Many of you may already be familiar with those. We're going to then look at what data flow mapping is about, the key elements in a data flow, the benefits of conducting a data mapping exercise, the challenges in doing it, the techniques and some of the best practices around data flow mapping. And there's going to be a live demonstration given by our software business analyst, Natasha Calder, on the data flow mapping tool, which has been developed and only just launched by our subsidiary company, Vigilant Software, which is available through our IT governance one-stop shops. This webinar is going to take in all about an hour. Our outward bound information from Natasha and I will take up about 45 or 50 minutes. At the end of that period, there should be about 10 or 15 minutes left for Q&A. You'll find that you're all muted. That's to protect everybody from background noise and so on. Please do, if you find you have a question, use the question function in the GoToWebinar panel, which will be on your screen. If you type a question in there, do feel free to type a question in just as soon as you think you have a question. When we come to the Q&A section, then what I will do is I will read out questions, starting with the ones that have been asked earliest, and then I'll share with you our answer to the question. We'll get through as many of those questions as we can in whatever time is remaining, but the objective is to finish this webinar by 4 o'clock British Summer Time today, so that you can all get on with whatever else you have planned for today. First question usually is, are these slides going to be available? Yes, they'll go out typically towards the end of this week, the beginning of next week, to everybody registered on this webinar. So, brief background then. GDPR applies to all organizations across the European Union. The UK is still a member of the European Union, and so it applies in the UK as well, irrespective of legislation. The fact that the government is legislating to ensure that GDPR survives the date of Brexit, whenever that should be, gives added certainty to organizations about the data protection regime within which they're going to be working. And essentially, GDPR extends the data rights of individuals fairly substantially, makes them very clear and specific in some areas, and requires organizations to put clear and and transparent policies and procedures in place to protect personal data and to have the necessary technical and organizational measures in to do that. It was adopted by the European Union in April 2016 and became law. It entered into force on the 24th of May 2016. It applies across the European Union from the 25th of May 2018. So we've now got something in the order of 8 months to get compliant with a set of very specific requirements, which are very much more substantial than we had to contend with under the Data Protection Act. And given the reality that many organizations across the European Union, and particularly in the UK, aren't that particularly compliant with the Data Protection Act, the amount of work to be done in a relatively short space of time is considerable. GDPR applies to any organization which is processing the data of persons. If the organization is based inside the European Union or outside of it, providing services into the European Union, it's within the territorial scope of GDPR. If it is any natural person, a living person, therefore not a company, a natural person, irrespective of nationality or place of residence, their data is protected under GDPR. And that is personal data which is processed wholly or partly by automated means, or which is part of or meant to be part of a filing system. So to a very real extent, GDPR is the first global data protection regulation. It affects organizations all the way across the world. The European Union is one of the biggest trading blocs. It's the one regulation which affects every organization around the world providing services into the European Union. So significant law. The penalties for non-compliance are equally significant. And there are two areas of challenge. The first is that data subjects, that's you and me, are entitled to bring actions, to bring complaints, to seek judicial remedy for financial or non-financial harm. That's a very significant area that should drive compliance activities in organizations, because those kinds of cases can eat up time, effort, energy, and lead to financial rewards even for non-material damage. Similarly, simultaneously, administrative fines for which there is a tariff. The lower level of transgression brings fines up to 2% of last year's global turnover, or 10 million euros, whichever is the higher. And the significant fines, which are around breaches of the data processing principles, breaches of the natural rights of data subjects, or breaches of the transport of data processing requirements, can bring fines up to 4% of global turnover, or 20 million euros, again, whichever is the higher. Of course, they are ceilings. That means fines will be anywhere between not very much and the ceiling. I wouldn't expect to see top-level fines applied immediately. That removes weapons from the supervisory authorities' quiver, so to speak. But as the transition carries forward and as misdemeanors or transgressions occur under the GDPR compliance requirements, we will begin to expect to see fines, and the number of fines mounting through the course of next year. So given that, it makes sense to be sure that you know what personal data you're processing, that you're processing in accordance with the law, and that you're able to protect it. Many organizations faced with the question of what personal data have you got mostly spend the first half hour thinking about that, saying and ah. The reality is that organizations are often processing much more data than they realize, and a data flow is the mapping of data from one place to another. So for instance, from a supplier into the customer might pass through a number of hands, and then it's dealt with by the customer and by a number of entities inside the customer. Data flows also pass inside and outside the European Union, either because you have customers or suppliers outside the European Union, or indeed because you are using a cloud-based service provider who processes or stores data in the cloud somewhere else in the world. So data flow mapping is the key step once you've done an overall gap analysis to find out where your key gaps are, it's the key step to take to identify what data you've got, where it's flowing inside the organization, and from there to begin working out how you bring those flows into compliance with the GDPR. And we'll look a little bit at some of the issues around that, and then when Natasha is doing the live demonstration, you'll begin to see how using a practical tool, you can do that exercise relatively quickly. So essentially a data flow, and what GDPR is looking for you to do is to walk through the whole information lifecycle. You're collecting information from or about natural persons, data subjects, and what you're trying to do is see from the point at which you collect that data all the way through to the point at which the data is destroyed, because yes, data should be destroyed. You should not be holding data for longer than the purpose for which you originally collected it. So that entire information life cycle, the data is protected against any one of the potential threats that might undermine the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of that data. So that's the first objective of a data flow audit or data flow map, to make sure you've identified the way in which data is being used, to make sure that when necessary, those people who are using the data or about whom the data is gathered have been consulted on the use of the data, and to make sure that any of the future uses of data have been properly thought about. For instance, if you're collecting data on the grounds that, and you're holding it on the grounds that you might one day find it useful, GDPR prohibits that basis for collecting data. So you need to be clear about what potential future uses of data might be before you collect it. So data mapping challenges start with what personal data are we collecting? You need to be clear from GDPR of the definition of personal data, and it is anything that enables a person to be identified. It includes obviously names, identifiers, identity numbers, passport numbers, and so on. It includes less obviously, but just as importantly, online identifiers like IP addresses, usernames. It includes location data, health biometric data, anything that enables a person to be identified falls into the classification of personal data. So you've got to identify what personal data you are collecting. You've got to identify where you're collecting it. You've got to identify the circumstances under which you're collecting it. You've got to work out what kinds of technical and organizational safeguards you put in place to protect the rights and freedoms of the data subjects. GDPR is about rights and freedoms of data subjects. It's not about protecting the entity that collects the data. It's about protecting individuals. So what technical and organizational safeguards are there in place to ensure that the data subject's data is being dealt with properly? That means you've got to understand the legal and regulatory obligations you have in respect of that data and ensure that the way you're dealing with data enables you to demonstrate that you're meeting those obligations. And when you're doing all of those, you're going to be complying with GDPR. So a data flow map or a data flow audit is a key tool to put yourself in place to identify detailed gaps between your actual practices and the requirements of GDPR, and to build trust and confidence in your audience as to how you're managing their data. So the key elements then in a data flow audit start with what is the data items: name, email address, health data, criminal records, biometrics, as we've seen. What format have you collected the data in? Is it in paper, hard copy format, soft copy format? Is it on a USB stick? Is it stored in a database? What's the format of the data? How are you moving it? Obviously, if you're moving a physical document by forked stick, the risks to that data is rather different than if you're moving it by, if it's a digital document and you're moving it by email across the internet. So transfer methods internally and externally, and where is the data being collected? Where is it being stored? In offices, in the cloud, with third parties. These are the four key elements in any data flow audit. And so the techniques that you might use in putting together a data flow audit, there are a number of ways in which you can gather the data, because the reality is many organizations do not have documented workflows. If you're an ISO 9001 or 14001 or any other company with a certificated management system, you may well already have a documented workflow, which is therefore a good starting point for you in terms of looking at personal data, because you'll want to take your documented workflow and you'll want to track specifically personal data moving through that workflow. Remember, GDPR data flow mapping is about personal data, not necessarily about other data. So look at existing documents, have workshops with everybody involved in a process to try and find out what data they're collecting, how it's being dealt with. You could design and circulate questionnaires. You could have a team who goes around and watches how personal data is collected, processed, and what actually happens. Remember, what you're trying to do with a data flow audit is identify what actually happens rather than what happens in theory. If your theory about how your data is flowing is different from reality and you have a breach in reality, you're going to have a fine in reality. You might do a data flow with post-it notes or onto a whiteboard where you can talk to members in the team and say, what happens to this piece of data next? Where does it go to next? Who sees it? You can do it with mind map tools, template drawings. They're all techniques which you can use to map data. The key thing is, what questions do you ask? Whatever technique do you use, how are you going to identify the inputs and outputs of your workflow? And that's all a workflow is. It's something which has data coming in at one end and data going out at the other end. Typically, the output of a process or of a workflow is an input to another process. So how is the personal data collected? First question you're typically asking. Is it in some form of paper or electronic form? Is it offline? Is it being captured on a telephone or call center? Who's accountable for that personal data? Who determined that we needed to collect that data? What is that data actually going to be used for? Where is the data stored? Where's it being moved to? If it's in a database, where is the database stored? If it's being also put into a spreadsheet, where is that spreadsheet stored? Who has access to it? Who is sharing the information? Which suppliers or third parties might have access to the information, and why? Why do they need to see it? How does the system transfer data to other systems? Is it hosted somewhere else? All of them are steps in thinking through how data is dealt with. A complex data flow map might look a bit like the picture you see on the screen right now. There is a data flow map, which, as you can see if you look in the middle on the left-hand side, identifies data which has been collected through some institution called factotum and is moved then into office telephones and then into a Salesforce CRM system. And you can see, looking at a simple flow like this, a number of different assets which are involved in supporting data, a number of different directions in which data flows, and having an overall picture like that of a fairly complex data flow enables you to begin to understand what you need to do to manage data. If I take a slightly less well-structured data flow, such as, for example, an organization which runs a very active recruitment campaign, the example which you see here on the screen is looking at how CVs get processed through an organization. So in the example, you've got HR users who are getting CVs sent from recruitment service databases. You've got outplacement services sending emails with data in. You've got outsourced management companies sending candidate information in. You've got candidates sending information direct and via agencies. A number of different ways in which data is coming in, and a number of different users of that data, a number of different places the data is going to. You need to be able to track each of those, because without tracking each of those, you don't realize how data is actually moving around. And if you don't realize how it's being used, you don't realize there are some third parties who are seeing the data, you will be unable to put in place appropriate or adequate checks. So I'm going to look at now briefly, as introduction to a data flow audit tool, what you might be looking for in a process report sample. I talked about what a big overview of a data flow map might look like, but what you're really looking for is something that tells you for each data flow more than just, gosh, here it is. It needs to start telling you stuff about what the process is, what the lawful basis of processing is, and you need to be capturing that data as you're doing your data flow audit. So what you're looking to get to typically is a process report that says we've looked at a data flow, and for this example, the process we've looked at might be customer surveys. How do we do a survey? The scope of the audit is the gathering and analyzing of survey responses from existing customers. So we're going to look at the people who put the survey together. We're going to look at how the data is collected. We're going to look at what happens to the data. The purpose of the processing, because we're collecting and therefore we're processing personal data, is to gain an insight into customer backgrounds and profiles in order to inform future marketing strategies. Remember that the second data processing principle is that you have to have a clear purpose for the processing, and the purpose needs to be legitimate, and it needs to be transparent and fairly and lawfully communicated to the data subject. So what is the purpose of processing? At the point that you're creating your data flow map is the point to try and work that out. Quite often when you're doing this, you'll find 2 or 3 different variants that different people inside the team have, and practically you're going to simply note those down, because as you come back around to tidy it up, you're going to want to narrow down and be very clear about what the real purpose of that processing is. So summary in this particular process, and this reflects the work which you're about to do. So this is a summary from the sections we'll look at in a minute. The process takes consent as the lawful basis for processing data items. You'll remember that there are a number of bases for consent, a number of bases for lawful processing, of which consent is one. It's not necessarily always the favorite or the most appropriate, but you need to have an appropriate lawful basis. If you don't have a proper lawful basis for processing data, then you simply can't process the data. The mapping identifies that you don't have any special categories, or what used to be called sensitive data items under GDPR are called special categories of data. There is cross-border processing. That's important to know. If you remember, the highest level of fines apply to misdemeanors in terms of cross-border processing. It does not include transfers to locations outside of the EEA. So you can see that here it's transferring inside the EEA, that's cross-border, but not going outside the EEA. So the map, and Natasha in her demonstration will give you a brief introduction to each of those icons, but you can simply drag and drop icons into a screen. You can set the direction of flow. So you've got a personal data item, which is collected in a survey app. It's seen by research analysts through their screen. It's stored on an internal server. The data finds its way into report files, and at the end of the life cycle, it's securely destroyed. So you've got a very straightforward map. You can see exactly how that flows. You can see exactly what the assets are that are involved in it. And the point about using a tool, if you decide to use a tool, is you can do this kind of thing in a consistent way across all of the processes inside the organization. You should also be doing and building, as you're running your data flow audits, your personal data inventory. Remember, if you're going to manage personal data, you need to know what data you've got. If you have a breach, and normal starting point from an information security perspective is that you're going to be breached sooner or later. If you don't know what data you've got, you won't know where to look when you're breached. If you don't know what data you've got, you won't know where to look for the data that a data subject asks for when they lodge their data subject access request, which, remember, you have a month to respond to, and you can't charge them a fee to respond. So the personal data inventory you're building as you are doing the data flow audits. In this case, you're identifying that the personal data you're processing is age, gender, job title, email address, and a username. The data subject is a customer, and the lawful basis for processing each of those is consent. Remember that, again, the requirement under GDPR is that consent or lawful basis of processing, as the case may be, must be granular. You can't wrap up 3, 4, 5 data items that might have different lawful basis and try and have them all agreed to as a single item. It must be possible for a data subject, particularly if you're relying on consent, to withhold consent for one item of processing but not for another. It's invalid consent if you force people to accept 4 or 5 things at the same time. This also means a data inventory that you're really creating at a higher level, an asset register. And again, Natasha will talk this through with you in a little bit more detail when she does the demonstration, but essentially you're able to look at the fact that you've got a series of assets, you've got a survey app, you've got report files, the icons indicate what type of an asset it is. We treat processes as an asset because they're part of the intellectual capital of the organization. So secure destruction obviously is a process or a sub-process. It's an asset. We look at the location. Unless the role that the organization has is that of a controller, if you're either a joint controller or a processor, you'd want to flag the fact that you need to have a special arrangement in terms of the contractual relationship with a joint controller or with a processor, and you need to make sure that you know what type of records that you've got. So that's what you get. I think this is probably as good a point as any to stop having me talk and to hand you over to Natasha, who will give you a live demonstration of Vigilance Software's data flow mapping tool. I'm going to just hand over to her, and in a second you will see her screen come up and she will take over the presentation. Natasha, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just loading my screen. Okay, great. So as Alan said, I'm going to give you a run through of Vigilance Software's data flow mapping tool, which is hosted in the cloud on a secure platform called CyberComply. The basis of any data flow map is the process that it represents. And within the data flow mapping tool, in the process area, you can create new processes and you can view and amend the details of your existing processes by selecting them when you have them in place. When you create a process, you need to provide the process title, and you also need to define the scope of the process and the purpose or purposes of processing. And in addition, you can select as the process owner any of the users that you have added to your account. You also have the option to show whether your organization is acting in the capacity of a data controller, data processor, third party, or whether the process represents a joint operation. But once you've created your process, you're essentially ready to get started on your data flow map, which I'll take you through to now. So once you access the mapping area for the first time, the first thing that you'll see is the inbuilt user manual, which is set to open by default for all new users of the data flow mapping tool. It gives comprehensive guidance on all aspects of the tool, and it also includes useful help articles on data flow mapping in the GDPR, as well as a glossary of terms. But when you exit the user manual, what you'll see is this sort of empty canvas with a toolbar running along the top. Now, plenty of you will be familiar with most of these tools. We've got undo, redo, duplicate, delete, zoom in, zoom out. We also have print and help, which opens the user manual. And there are 4 tools here which will be less familiar to you, but the purpose of which will become clear throughout the course of this demonstration. So to begin creating your data flow map, what you first need to do is add the assets that the process relies upon. And these assets, as has been mentioned earlier in this presentation, they can take the form of hardware, software, people, or sub-processes. Essentially, they're anything that's used to perform operations on personal data. So to that end, you can add new or existing assets to your map using the asset toolbar, which is docked here to the left of the canvas. When you expand this toolbar, you'll be able to see a library of the assets that you have created from other processes. That's because when you create an asset within the data flow mapping tool, it's a global entity. So that saves you from the repetitive work of creating the same assets in different maps. But if this is the first map that you're creating, then your asset library will be empty. Of course, if you do have existing assets and you need to filter them, you can do so using the search bar, which is fairly straightforward. And if you want to add any of these existing assets to your map, you can do so simply by navigating to the ones you need and clicking so that they appear. If you need to create a brand new asset, you can do that by obviously clicking the Add New Asset button. And from here, you'll see a list of available asset types, and you can add these to your map in just the same way as you can add an existing asset, which is simply by clicking on the asset type that you need. So I'm just going to collapse that asset library. And as you can see, the assets that we've selected now appear on the canvas. To add more information to your new asset, and this is the new asset that I've just created, you need to select that, and this will open a right-hand attributes panel. Your first option is to review or alter the asset type in case you've added the wrong asset type in error, and then you can change the reference of that asset, bearing in mind that this will become the label of the asset on the map. So I'm just going to simply call that file storage. Your next option is to review who operates the asset. And because we designated our organization as a controller for this particular process, all new assets that I create within this map will by default appear to be operated by the controller. However, it's very easy to overwrite this where needed simply by selecting the appropriate alternative from the drop-down list. So in this instance, I'm just going to select processor. Finally, I can select the country in which this particular asset is located, and then I save my changes by clicking apply. As you can see, the color of the asset has now changed, and this is because asset colors are based on that operator field. So controller assets are shown in purple, processor assets in amber, third-party assets in green, and joint assets are shown in blue. So now that we've added some information to this new asset, what we probably want to do next is to marshal all the assets into an order that matches the step of our fictional process. So to do this, I'm going to switch to the Move tool and then drag and drop the assets to the desired location. And as I do this, the assets snap to the nearest point of the grid, which makes it much easier for me to organize these in a sensible, well-structured layout. My next task is to show how personal data enters into this process and how it is transferred between assets. And to start, I'm going to add a data input point by clicking on this 3-dot icon. This causes a grey dot to appear on the screen that I can manipulate in much the same way as the other assets. Next, I'm going to draw transfer lines between the assets by switching over to the connection tool, hovering until I see an orange dot and clicking, and repeating until all my lines are complete. As you can see, the first transfer line that I've drawn here is visually distinguished from the rest by a dotted line. This is because it represents an inbound transfer. So in other words, that's the point where personal data first enters the process, rather than a normal asset-to-asset transfer. It's also worth noting that the arrows on the asset-to-asset transfers are directional and correspond exactly to the order in which you select your input and output points. So what we've got here is a good visual representation of this particular fictional process. What we need to do now is record how personal data flows through it and how. And to do this, I'm going to switch back over to the hand tool and select this first transfer on the map. You'll see the options that appear this time in the right-hand panel are different because obviously we're looking at a type of transfer rather than an asset. The first thing to do is select the method of transfer by choosing the appropriate option from the drop-down list. And this Okay, apologies for the delay. I'm going to carry on going. Okay, so I'm here now in the data items panel. What I need to do at this point is review the categories of data that are entering into the process. So as you can see, there's a list of data item types here, and this includes at the bottom all those categories of personal data that constitute special categories of personal data under the GDPR. And I can select all the different types of data that enter the process at this point. So if I select perhaps age, gender, and job title, and then I can also select who that data belongs to. So in this case, I'm going to say that it's customers. I also have the option to select the lawful basis for processing. You might not yet know what your lawful basis for processing is, and if this is the case, you can leave this field blank and complete it at a later date. But if you do know what the lawful basis for processing is, you simply select the appropriate option from the drop-down list, and like so, and you can save your selection by clicking OK. On the data items button, you'll now be able to see that there's a summary of how many data items are entering the process at this particular point. I'm going to click apply now and show you the difference between adding information to an inbound data transfer and adding information to an asset-to-asset transfer. So on this occasion, when I expand the attributes panel for the asset-to-asset transfer, this panel looks very much the same. Once again, I can select a transfer method, and in this case, I'm going to say it's a download, and I can go and expand the data items panel. However, on this occasion, I won't be able to add any new data items. Rather, what I can see is a list of data items that I have inherited from earlier on in the process. And you can alter the selection to show whether all or only some of the data items are transferred to the next asset. So if in this instance we say that only age and job title are transferred to the next asset. And then if I click apply, you can once again see that there's a summary of how many data items are being transferred at this point on the data items button. If you know that more data enters the process at any point, you can simply add further inbound transfers at the relevant locations. So what we've got now is a map that consists of assets, transfers, and personal data. The thing that remains to do is to add information about the various records that are created or updated as part of this process. And records we view as being static items that are stored on individual assets. So to add one, you need to select the asset that contains the record, to expand this attributes panel once more, and then hit the add records button. Now at the moment this area is blank because there are no existing records. So to create a new record, I click on add record button, and then I have a number of fields to fill out. The first is the name of the record, which I'm going to call a survey report. And then I can select the classification of the record, and in this case I'm going to say it's confidential, and I can choose the format as well. And the most important distinction here is whether the record takes a digital or a physical form, and in this case I'm going to say that this is a physical record and that it is text, and I can also define the retention period. If you don't know the retention period, if it's not yet been defined, this is a field that you can leave blank and return to complete at a later date. But for the sake of argument, let's say that the retention period for this particular record is 6 months. I can then also add a list of the recipients, so that is to say anyone to whom this record is disclosed, and in this case I'm going to say that it is marketing and the research team. When I hit save, I can see a nice summary of that particular record in the records panel, and if I just collapse that panel again, I can see a summary of how many records are associated with this particular asset. Once you're happy with your map, and I'm not going to go through adding all the data items to every single transfer and adding records to all the assets for the sake of time. But once you are happy with the map and you've got all the information that you need upon it, you can generate a report by clicking the print button here, which will open the print preview. And you've already seen elements of this in the webinar already. It contains a process overview, which covers all the information you added about your process when you created it, as well as a summary based on the information that you added to your map. And that includes what the lawful basis for processing is, whether any special categories of personal data are processed, and whether the processing includes any cross-border processing or transfers to locations outside of the EEA. This is followed by a preview of your data flow map, along with a link to the full version of the map in the browser, which is in turn followed by a personal data inventory, which lists all the data items involved in the process, and an asset register. As you can see, this table shows whether the selected country of the asset is within the EEA, and this table will show whether countries are located in the EEA, whether they've been subject to an EC adequacy decision, or whether they are located outside of the EEA. The table also highlights those assets that are not operated by the controller, as you can see here with this warning exclamation mark in an orange triangle. And this is because you need to be particularly aware of those assets that are not operated by you, as you may need to implement additional measures to protect personal data when it passes to assets that are outside of your control. The rest of the report contains a list of records that are involved in the process and details of all the transfers that are included in this particular process. And you can either print this report directly or save it as a PDF. Once you're finished, to return to the process area, you simply save your map and click close. And if you're interested in finding out more about the data flow mapping tool, there's a link to the product page at the end of this webinar. And thank you very much for listening, and I will now pass you back over to Alan.
Thank you, Natasha. There we go. Right, so thank you, Natasha. So just to sum up, the practical steps for conducting a data flow audit or a data flow map. The first step is to document the scope and purposes of processing. A data flow map is an essential component in a data protection impact assessment. You can't work out impact on the rights and freedoms of natural persons unless you know what data you've got and where it's flowing. It's a key element in delivering on the requirement to embed data protection by design and by default in the organization's processes. Again, unless you're aware of what's happening to personal data and how it's being dealt with, you can't ensure that at all levels data protection is fundamental to how you operate. So document the scope and purposes of processing. Step 2 is to add personal data to a data flow map of the process. If you've already got a data flow map, if not, you need to create a data flow map that includes personal data. Step 3 is to add supporting assets used to process personal data, and you need to know what the supporting assets are because they form part of the control environment. If you have an unpatched operating system, for instance, there's the possibility, as we've seen, of a ransomware attack being successful, a ransomware attack that makes data not available for the purposes for which it was collected is as much of a breach as is the destruction or loss of data. Step 4 is to add data transfers to show the flow of data between assets to make sure that there are no intermediate steps, and also to enable you to consider security in the data flows. You need to be thinking about data security both in flight and at rest. So email encryption, for instance, is a sensible mechanism to be considering in relation to data in flight. Step 5, review the process, make sure that there is nothing that you've missed out on. So that's it. Those are the practical steps to conducting a data flow audit. I'm going to turn in a minute to the questions you've got. There are a number of self-help materials available from the IT Governance One-Stop Shops, a pocket guide, a manual, a gap assessment tool. There are training courses both at foundation and practitioner level as well as one on data protection impact assessments. And of course, there's the data flow mapping tool, which Natasha gave us a demonstration of and which enables you to automate and standardize, or part automate and standardize the way in which you map data flows. And then finally, of course, there's a substantial range of consultancy products, consultancy services available to help organizations tackle GDPR compliance. So let me turn to questions. As I said at the beginning, if you have questions, please type them into the question function in the GoToWebinar control panel. I'm going to read out the question starting at the first one asked, and then I'll share with you the answer, and I'll get as far as I can in the remaining 18 minutes we've got this afternoon. I'm using a CRM system on the cloud as SaaS. Does the vendor owning the CRM system become a processor? Almost certainly only in respect to the fact that they're providing archiving and storage services. In that respect, they're certainly a processor, but you are using the service they provide you in order to process the data. You've decided you're a controller, you've decided what data you're collecting, you're doing a lot of the processing of it yourself, but you've clearly outsourced the hosting, the backup, and all of those aspects. So that will need to be dealt with in a process or contract. Wholly or partly by automated means, does that mean we can ignore any manual processes? Yes, on the face of it, it does, as long as the manual process doesn't lead to the storage of that data in a filing system. So if your manual process has no filing system at the beginning or the end of it, and the filing system would include something like, for business cards, a Rolodex, then yes, you can ignore data in it. How does this affect a B2B organization? It applies. A B2B organization is collecting and processing personal data. Alan Calder at itgovernance.com identifies me. It might be a business address, but it still identifies me, and GDPR makes no distinction between identification of people in a business environment as distinct from a home environment. So the practical answer, and there are several questions I think on this subject, is that B2B information has to be treated just like B2C information. It's personal data, and all of your obligations as a controller or processor are owed in respect of that information, irrespective of the circumstance under which you collected it. So that's the next question about business job title and email address. Yes, it counts as personal data subject to GDPR. Data should be kept no longer than necessary, but we'd like to keep sales data indefinitely. Is that okay? No, it's not. You may only keep data for as long as is necessary to achieve the purpose for which you collected it. And the purpose itself needs to be legitimate. I think you'll struggle to find a legitimate purpose, which is, I'd like to keep this for as long as I like to keep it in case something useful comes up that I can use it for. There has to be a legitimate, clear purpose, which has to be set out to the data subject, and as does the lawful basis for the processing. It's possible that you might say to the data subject, I'd like to keep the data for as long as you're alive in order to update my health records. That's legitimate if you're a doctor or a health clinician and the data subject knows it. I think that's a legitimate basis. So it's not that it's prohibited, it's simply that you can only keep data for as long as is necessary to achieve the purpose for which it's been collected. Do HMRC and local councils have to abide by GDPR? Yes. Will data flows be expected of them in the same way as for anybody else? You can't embed data protection, you can't do a data protection impact assessment, you can't apply the data processing principles without having done a data flow audit. So yes. Can you hold on to data as a processor after it's been processed? Is there a reasonable time it can be held for? A processor can only hold data, can only retain data in line with the contract it has from a controller. And technically, at the end of a contract, a processor should return to a controller whatever data it obtained from or on behalf of the controller. There are obvious technical difficulties to do with that around how information is archived and backed up. There are some temporary procedural solutions available on the ICO's website, but essentially, no, you can't keep data after you've processed it or after the contract has finished. You should be returning it to the controller who is accountable for that data. Do unsolicited incoming emails have to be considered? Yes, they do. You can reject them, you can ignore them, you can not respond to them. But if you decide to process the data, you need to tell the data subject what you're going to do. You can't have somebody email you and say, I'd like to know your telephone number so I can call you about something, and promptly start sending them emails about products and services that you'd like to sell to them. There's no lawful basis for doing that. If you want to do that, you'd have to send them a privacy notice saying, you emailed us, I got your information from your email, I've got a legitimate interest, I believe, in sending you information about stuff we do as you asked about it, and so I'm going to start sending you marketing literature. This is how you can withdraw consent, or how you can object. When you say identify appropriate technical safeguards, does that mean the data flow map should detail whether transmitted or stored data is Article 32 compliant, i.e. anonymized or pseudonymized or encrypted? So Article 32 simply talks about a number of ways in which an organization can ensure that data is secure. Yes, you should be looking at the data flow in-flight and data storage to determine how you've secured that data. But it's more than just simply encryption or pseudonymization. People need to access the data, so you need to be looking at access control policies, for instance. Having spoken to several suppliers, deleting specific data from backups and archives is near on impossible. Currently, that is the case. It is near on impossible. The phrase, the state of the art in GDPR, we think means that you need to pay attention to evolving and emerging mechanisms which might make it possible for you to actually delete data. Means that you should be thinking about, when you collect data, how long you might need to store it for, and thinking about planning backups on that basis. Nevertheless, the Information Commissioner does currently offer, there is a code of practice which you can access through her website, guidance on how you can, to all intents and purposes, put data beyond practical use. And you would be able to, if you can demonstrate that you've implemented that code, rely on that if you found yourself dealing with an action for a breach. Most organizations use external payroll providers. How does one ensure that the information processed using the software and then automatically transferred to HMRC and pension providers is processed under the rules of GDPR? The onus lies on you. You're the controller. They're your employees, so it's up to you to select a payroll provider who is GDPR compliant, to give them, they will be a processor, a contract that instructs them how the data is to be processed and what they are to do with it, which will include an instruction for them to transfer that data on to HMRC, to perhaps issue payroll slips or whatever it is you do. But you're the controller, so the obligation and accountability is on you, unquestionably, to ensure that data is processed by you and by your processors in compliance with GDPR. Under the inventory section, do we need to add details of the customer? That's entirely up to you as to how you identify data. If you do, if it's helpful to identify data by customer category or customer type, the tool enables you to do that. It's infinitely adaptable. Does a CV count as one item for the purposes of consent, or does it need to be broken down into its component parts? I would think that you could treat a CV as a single item and say the data on your CV we will use for the purposes of considering your application to work for us. We're going to assume that because you sent us this, you've consented to us using it for that purpose. If you wish to withdraw consent, this is how you do so. If we think we want to use it for any other purpose, we'll come back to you. But yes, one item for a single purpose. Are there exceptions to retaining information on data subjects within nurseries and colleges? There are exceptions to retaining data where you have a statutory obligation or some other overriding obligation to retain the data. So, and these are areas in which you'd probably want to take specific legal advice if you're looking for overriding options. But yes, they do exist. There are circumstances under which you might retain data. The right to deletion, Google often quoted as an example, but they hid results rather than destroying data. How can you realistically delete all copies when there are backups, many out of your control, such as third-party email servers that document pass through? So this comes down to what you can realistically do. GDPR doesn't mandate an absolute removal. It mandates deletion of data to the extent that you can possibly and practically do that, and it's based, after all, on the idea of risk to data subjects. So arguably the fact that data is put beyond reach, nobody can access it, achieves that end, and if there's no method of deleting it, I think you can argue that you've met the requirements of GDPR by doing that. Remember that GDPR is a law, and that means many of the areas of uncertainty and interpretation will be decided not by me or you or necessarily by supervisory authorities, but will be decided in courts of law up and down and across the European Union for the next 10 to 15 years. We had a brief period when we lost audio, and then we got back into work. Yes, you can select multiple methods of transfer for data. You might see them as different data flows. You might see a paper data flow as being a different data flow than a digital data flow. That's likely to give you better control over what you're doing. Do you have to create a data map for every which way you use data? No, you might have one or two very simple processes where a data map doesn't give you anything useful. Data flow maps are really useful for processes where there are a number of steps in the process, a number of parties involved, and you want to be sure that you've identified all of the components in that process. This current tool doesn't enable import of processes from other tools. I'm not sure what the development pathway looks like. If the joint operator is chosen, does the tool allow you to document what additional measures have been taken? Yes, I believe it does. How would we suggest dealing with existing data that's already within the system is a good and important question. GDPR says that on the 25th of May 2018, you must be in compliance. That means that the data you are processing on that day must comply with GDPR. It doesn't mean the data you collect after that day must be in compliance. That means that any data which you've collected in the last 20 years needs to comply. So if you're holding data right now, which is older than it should be given the purposes for which you collected it, you need to delete it or otherwise remove it. If you don't have a lawful basis under GDPR for processing the data, you technically won't be able to process it on the 25th of May. One key area to be looking at is employee contracts. Most employee contracts in the UK will rely on consent as a lawful basis, and it's clear that as the relationship between employer and employee is considered unequal, the Information Commissioner has said this would be an invalid basis for processing data, and that means that virtually every employer in the United Kingdom between now and the 25th of May will have to put in place a number of alternative lawful bases of processing, which will be a combination of, in order to fulfill a contract, to meet statutory and regulatory obligations, perhaps to some of them for consent, but for different elements of data, you'll have to make sure you've got a proper lawful basis for processing. The data, can a list of personal data items be found anywhere to ensure nothing is overlooked? Yes, there's a fairly solid set of options in the tool. We know that the training courses and books and manuals which we publish, which you can go on, have got pretty comprehensive lists of data types, but the sensible starting point is GDPR itself. You can download a copy of the regulation for free from the European Commission regulation website, and it defines data, personal data, in Article 4, and that's probably a good starting point. I'm looking at this from a DP, data protection risk management perspective. Some of my colleagues are looking at this from the perspective of improving business processes. Would this tool assist both? Yes. We invariably find that when you start mapping processes for whatever compliance purpose, you discover that there are steps in the process that you don't need. You're collecting and doing things with data that you don't need to do, or you could consolidate steps. So unquestionably, it can improve business. What about data about people's work, email passwords? Yes, email password. A password on its own doesn't identify anybody. A password is simply a random set of data, hopefully a complex random set of data, but an email address does. What is the cost of the cyber comply? That's really a conversation to talk with IT governance about. I may have missed this, but would this also function as the database behind a retention schedule? Yes, you could use this as a retention schedule because you're mapping for each of the processes what your retention objective should be. It's a really useful tool. Article 30 of GDPR requires you to document your data processing. The data flow mapping tool is a really useful tool in enabling you to do that. It does exactly what the Article 30 is asking you to do. It maps what you're doing, captures a description of it, enables you to absolutely meet that requirements. We have many processes within each department. We create one map for each department that covers all, or one for each process. And again, that's a matter of personal preference and simplicity. Typically, you'd think about mapping processes on the basis of who the process owner is, and you try and map the process for that process owner. In an environment where processes haven't previously been mapped, it's a good idea to nominate somebody who will own what you think of as being the most significant process, start with that, and then see where it branches out to. I back up my data to a cloud backup provider. How does that fit with the data flow audit? So you would identify that one of the steps in your data flow is a backup. You'd identify a cloud service provider as the entity to which you'd back up, and you'd ask the questions about, is that cloud service provider inside or outside the EEA, etc. So it enables you to identify absolutely clearly what the processing looks like. We hold qualification achievement data for learners. Would this mean we can hold the results as long as the individual is alive? No, not necessarily. The reality is that if you are holding the data, and if your agreement with the data subject is that you will hold the data for a specific period in order to achieve a specific objective, and you've told them that, and you've got a lawful basis of doing so, yes, you can do that, but you can't simply do it because you want to. If customer data is redacted in our CRM system after a given period of time, is that acceptable, or does the data need to be completely deleted? You don't necessarily need to do either. Remember, you should retain data and are entitled to retain data for the whole of the period that it's necessary for you to process that data to achieve the objective for which it was collected. There's no necessity for deleting data or blacking data out after a month, a year, 2 years, if the purpose for which you collected it is still valid. If you've got a Rolodeck of business card, is this their data or the organization's? Well, I think that's up to you as an organization, but typically if they're collecting a Rolodeck as part of the information they're gathering while doing their job, all of that information would normally belong to the organization, and the Rolodeck would therefore be the organization's. If somebody on leaving said they wanted to take the file with them, you would typically, I would expect, say, no, this is data you've gathered while being a part of the organization. It's part of a structured filing system, and it's subject to GDPR. I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, we are running out of time. I'm going to pick up just 2 more questions, and we are then going to stop. We have to report sales over a period of years. If we cannot keep sales data indefinitely, what about keeping summary data? You can keep any data you like as indefinitely as you like, as long as it's not personal data for which you don't have a lawful basis of retention. So summary data, which says you dealt with 500 different people and your sales added up to this of those products, doesn't identify any person. So it's perfectly legal to keep it for as many millennia as you like. All you can't keep without a lawful basis is information that identifies individuals. So summary data, I can't see any sort of problem there at all. Are we expected to action a rights to be forgotten request before the end of the product retention period? For example, the customer's account is recently closed and they want all records of them and their account to be deleted. However, we have a retention period of 7 years and provide this data to the credit reference agency. Which one takes priority? Well, that's slightly more complex. So first of all, they have to have the right to exercise the right to be forgotten. There has to be a ground for exercising it, and that's not an absolute or automatic right. There are limits on when you can exercise it. So assuming that the limits don't apply and that they are able to exercise their right to be forgotten, you have to comply with it unless there are overriding alternative reasons for retaining the data, and that's also a GDPR option or requirement. And so you need to consider, A, you might have a statutory obligation to retain data for VAT or HMRC or NI or statutory accounting reporting, so you retain the data. Their desire to have it deleted doesn't override your necessity to keep it. The fact that you've got a retention period of 7 years, which is built on an automatic fallback, won't necessarily get you off the hook. If the business you're in is involved in providing information to credit reference agencies, and you don't have a lawful basis for doing that, I suspect you might not, then you would be entitled to say to the data subject, yes, we can erase this data, but it will mean that there is a black mark in your credit reference. You're entitled to tell people the consequence of an action before carrying it out. It's certainly an area, without knowing more about your specific circumstances, where I'd encourage you to talk to your own data protection lawyers about exactly how to deal with it. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid that really does bring us to the end of the time that we had allocated to this. I hope the webinar has been useful to you. If there's anything we can do to help, please do come on to IT Governance One-Stop Shops. Do talk to us. If you want to know more about the data flow mapping tool, please do give us a shout and we'll do what we can. There is an ongoing series of webinars, both on specialist subjects and introductory webinars to GDPR. These will continue as the countdown towards 25th of May comes and goes. Thank you very much for being with us, and I wish you a very good rest of Wednesday. Bye-bye.